Okay, I think we hit a good number, so I think we can get started.
Yeah.
Good to go, Linda?
Yes,
All right.
absolutely.
Hey, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're all based. Thank you for connecting into our session today. Yeah, it's a real a privilege to be chatting to you and sharing the session. My name's Jared Trussler, and my pronouns are he, him. By way of introduction, I'm a product manager for Dow. I'm based in the Netherlands. I've been here about 12 months. So prior to moving to the Netherlands with Dow, I was based in Bangkok in Thailand for 3 years. During that time, I was leading our LGBTQ plus ERG, which we know as GLAD. Working throughout the Asia Pacific region. I still work with GLAD very heavily. I am a member of our global steering team and work here now that I'm in Europe with our European team on various initiatives and various parts of our policy programs. But I have the pleasure of sharing the virtual stage with my friend and colleague, Linda Lim. So hand over to you to introduce yourself, Linda.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Linda Lim. I'm based in Singapore. And when Jared moved to Europe, I took over the role of regional lead for our GLAD team in Asia Pacific. So this project that we are going to be walking you through today, it's kind of like a collaboration and maybe Jared's legacy as he left Asia Pacific. By day, my day job is I'm the business communications director for our packaging and specialty plastics business in the region. I also have a communications lead for our sports marketing solutions business. That's the global responsibilities, and of course, it has a lot to do also with our Olympic partnership. Very excited to to talk about this project because this is really representing what I think ERG should be working on. How do you impact the workplace? Not just focus on organizing events, but looking at purposeful impact on the environment and the context that we live and work in. So Jared, over to you to get us started.
Yeah, absolutely, Linda. And I mean, at the end of the day, you've summarized it well. This is really a relatively small update in terms of the policy change. It's one piece of policy in a region. But at the end of the day, it's these type of changes that really have big impact. And from a context of a big company like Dow, I feel that this is when we are walking our talk, right? It's one thing to have a strategy on inclusion, but when we make these meaningful changes, particularly on people policy, that's when we're coming to the to the table and saying, we're going to live by what we're saying. So Linda, let's jump to the next slide. I wanted to highlight a little bit of where we. There we go. At the end of the day, Dow, I feel, has a very inclusive culture. Now, it's easy for me to say that. It's very hard to quantify. And I suppose it's the same that, many people out there for your companies, you would feel very passionate about what your organizations do on inclusion. But I feel that we really do, and I think through this program, walk our talk. But at the end of the day, I still think we've got a long way to go. Our policies do take time to catch up. And as we all know, society changes. The needs of the LGBTQ community evolve over time and they change. It's never stagnant. So we're never going to be at the perfect place where all of our policies are fully represented. But I think that as we talk through today, it's very important that we are identifying gaps, and they usually do start with a problem or an identified problem and start to bridge them, right? So for me, I mean, as I mentioned, I was based in Thailand. My husband and I went through the process of relocating with Dow, right? And going through that process was a bit of an eye-opening experience. I mean, I was fortunate enough that I've been out at Dow since day one. But as we're looking at relocating, working with HR and relocation partners, and I'm sure many of you can identify or relate to this. You know, some of those conversations, you just kind of walk out going, did that person really say what I thought they said? You know, an example being like, well, you know, yes, it's not easy. I mean, it's good you're married, like you've got a marriage certificate, that helps us a lot. But you know, it's difficult with irregular partners and you know, irregular relationships. I'm like, you're calling me irregular? You're calling my husband irregular? And you know, since then we've welcomed a daughter into our lives, and you know, there's been times that hosts go, you know, you're different dependents. I'm like, what? Different compared to who? I mean, you know. But anyway, you know, so nonetheless, I mean, as I was moving to Thailand, you know, we started to think, well, hey, not only do we have a lot of educating clearly to do, both inside and outside of DAO, but I think we really, you know, when I jumped on board with GLAD, we wanted to say, well, hey, are we walking our talk, right? You know, are people able to access, you know, equal benefits across the region? And obviously that's a big thing to bite off and you know, to do. But we started exploring around the region, you know, where there might be potential gaps that we could address. And obviously navigating all the different countries in a region like Asia Pacific is extremely complex. So, you know, HR definitely has a tough job in you know, evolving us so that we're constantly being able to meet the changing needs of society, and particularly our LGBTQ community. But nonetheless, it certainly shouldn't stop us from doing that. Now, in my view, big companies in particular, but actually, in fact, I think all companies need to take a tailored approach, right? So we need to say, well, hey, we're not going to have the perfect policy, but when something arises, well, let's figure out how we work through that and take an approach such that, you know, we live our inclusion through, you know, coming to the party, right? So, for example, you know, as I was traveling and, you know, my partner, my husband, was not recognized as my husband in Thailand. And so there are a lot of challenges there. But at the end of the day, Dow always said to me, we recognize you as a family, no matter where you are in the world. Mm-hmm. So nonetheless, that tailored approach was important, and we found ways to work around the system and, you know, navigate it. But nonetheless, as we're applying those tailored approaches, we're setting a precedent, right? And in my view, those precedents need to eventually become formalized policy, so that that's then the foundation for that next generation. So the next time someone's put in that situation, they don't have to go through all the awkward conversations and try to navigate it and figure it out, you know, as people move through their career in and out of DAO, right? So we're constantly building onwards and upwards. And so we're going to talk through what we did in terms of the family policy. But I do want to make sure that this story is also a story of allyship, right? And I think that we will share our learnings. Of course, we'll share what we did, but we'll share our learnings as we go. And, you know, there were some big ones for me as you know, a member of the LGBTQ community. These things can be very emotional when we're talking about people policy, right? When we're being called irregular, it can drive you nuts. But nonetheless, I think we all got some good learning, so we'd be happy to share as we go through. And again, feel free to throw any questions into either the chat if you're in Zoom or through the Out and Equal page. But let's jump to the next slide, Linda, which is kind of the core of what did we want to do, right? So without going into the details of this slide just yet, I do want to preface by saying, well, essentially, families are different today than they were 10, 20 years ago. I mean, family has evolved, right? And as I said, you know, earlier as I was talking through, Dow has always, you know, said, they've said it to me personally, and I know that there's others out there they've said it to too, that we recognize same-sex couples as a family, right? We recognize different partnerships, let's call them non-traditional, even though I'm not a big fan of that, but nonetheless, non-heterosexual couples and as relationships, as families, because at the end of the day, we're all different, and we are. And so in a region like Asia Pacific, where marriage equality is very scarce, if not marriage equality, any form of same-sex partnership is still very scarce. This poses a challenge. This poses a challenge for individuals in relationships who if they were straight, would have access to certain benefits from working, for a company like Dow. As I moved to Thailand, I was fortunate enough that I had a marriage certificate from Australia, being Australian, and had that privilege, right? But you think about the context of perhaps two, Thai individuals, a Thai employee and their partner, who doesn't have the ability to get a marriage certificate in Thailand. And so, there becomes this gap. And when I was talking, and exploring the gaps with HR, that was one that is identified. So I said, if there was a long-term couple, here in Thailand, an employee, their partner, can they access things like carers benefits, leave relating to family or whatnot? And the answer was no, right? No, because they need to have something to prove that they're a couple. And, for me, that was a gap. And in full transparency here, right? I mean, I did come across an individual who said, well, it's easy to do now, right? I mean, if they want to get married, they can go to Australia or the US and get married. I'm like, come on, I don't think it's really fair or equal that everyone has to have a destination wedding if they're, want to access benefits, right? As great as that would be, that's not fair and equal. And so that's where we articulated this issue around this missing link, right? This missing link of a single document that you need that many people would not be able to demonstrate, let alone it may not be in reach for many. So in terms of this graphical representation, we have a family in that top left-hand corner. And in some situations that can be legal and, proved through a marriage certificate to access family benefits, whether you're straight or whether you're, a lesbian couple, same-sex couple, whatever type of relationship, that helps in a very simplistic way to prove that. But there are other circumstances, obviously, as we all know, where domestic partnership or no certificate is available, and that could be due to personal reasons. And this also applies to heterosexual couples, right? There may be couples out there who simply don't want to be married for whatever their motives. But personal reasons do exist. But there are also legal reasons, i.e. marriage is not allowed. And so do we want to walk our inclusion, talk? Do we want to come to the party? If the answer is no, then this isn't even a project, right? So it doesn't get off the ground. But if the answer is yes, we need to address that missing gap, which is how do we, prove, or how do we, recognize as an organization, as Dow in this context, that this is a partnership which we recognize. And so that was the crux of the project that we kicked off, and we wanted to address that missing link. Linda, I'm not sure, did I miss anything, or do you have any additional context to add as we sort of navigated this as the gap?
No, I think you've covered everything. There are a couple of points that I will address in later slides. So I think we're good here. Shall we move on?
Oh, yeah, let's jump forward.
Okay. So, once we've identified what the problem was and figured out that the solution was a missing link, now that's a theoretical part, right? How do we drive a change and create a change where things happen? I think it's very important that we identify the stakeholders that's going to help you to be successful in the change that you want to drive, or could be a potential roadblock. And this is where we've identified kind of like 5 key groups of stakeholders. My background is in communication, so this is where change communications and management comes in. So the first group of people we've identified are the champions, senior executives who can help back the idea. And we are very fortunate to have global ERG sponsor, our most senior out executive, that's Jim Fiddling, our CEO. But Luis Vega, I think who's the second most senior out executive, and also global sponsor Amy Wilson and folks like that being, very strongly behind us in what we're trying to do here. I think it makes sense, if you follow Jared's explanation, it completely makes sense. It's something that it's outdated and we need to address it. The second stakeholder that's going to help with making the project successful, we figured, was a sponsor, a senior executive who can legitimize the project and provide funding if needed. And again, We are very fortunate to have a regional, our regional president is the regional sponsor of our ERG, and he's super enthusiastic. He's like, use me however you need to. And he was with us in our project meeting, discussing, path forward and next steps and so on. Now, the third bucket of people are your influencers, people who have a say in whether the change can take place. So these are global and regional. It's people who are involved in people policies. So HR, total rewards, geographic HR partners, regional leadership team members, people leaders, and so on. And again, the context in DAO is such that inclusion is such a core value and core part of our strategic pillars that this was not a huge barrier for us. Now, the fourth bucket of stakeholders, the collaborator, competitor, I feel this is where the rubber hits the road. People whose job overlaps with what you're trying to do. So the actual, global and regional total rewards colleagues, the I&D leaders, and so on. And I think that there's one perspective here that I'd like to share with everyone is you need to pause and think. There's a fine line between making a colleague look like they're not doing their job because you've identified a gap and you're trying to solve it. And the fine line between that and making them seem as if they're going the extra mile in doing their job. So being able to take the right approach and build the right relationship with the people who's going to make things happen with you, it's critical. And then, of course, as important is the team that you're going to put together. People whose skills and knowledge you need in order to implement the change. And we've got a wonderful group of allies formed for this particular project. We have someone from legal, I&D, total rewards, and of course, ERG represented by Jared and I. You've got a great team when at some point in the project, we came to the realization that, this has got to be bigger than the ERG, the part where we say that it also applies to heterosexual couples. This is when we say that, hey, GLAD doesn't need the credit for this change. Let's make sure that, HR and DAO totally owns this so that it becomes part of reality more easily. So, with that, we also wanted to make sure that we figure out, how to get buy-in from the various group of stakeholders. And I think the key guiding principle is be pragmatic. Change is made out of many little steps. So I think the two important big bullets here. First one, make the proposed changes appealing to a broader group of people. You have to build relevance and win supporters. So, for example, our policy update is not limited to the LGBTQ plus community. Includes domestic partnership for heterosexual couples who decide for personal reasons not to get married. Of course, well within the laws of the land, right? For example, there's some type of relationship that are not condoned by legality, and so that's excluded. And then secondly is you define what can be influenced. DAO has ownership of all our policies and the benefits we give to our employees, and that's something that we can influence more easily. Now versus the country context. So for some reasons, countries like Malaysia and Indonesia are not included, and the key consideration for that really is the safety of our employees. If they out themselves, do they put themselves at unnecessary risk? So that's a consideration. Does not mean that the policy does not extend to them. It just means that in the way we communicate and capture the DAO policies, we do it differently. So one key, for example, key consideration is this is an internal definition only, applying only to DAO policies, not for government subsidies or funding, which for some countries, there tend to be quite a lot of that, especially in a place like Singapore, where we are trying to make sure that we have enough replacement population. So there's all kinds of family policies. Now, the other area that we look at was, let's set our baseline. And know what we will not be negotiating on. So number one is, no resultant change should disadvantage or advantage any group in particular. The goal is equality and fairness in treatment of all employees, as Jared mentioned, because right now there is a gap in equity, right? Our LGBT plus colleagues are not being treated equally as the rest of the employees. So that's a gap we want to close. The second principle we have here is that, religious, cultural, and social context should not affect DAO's approach and definition of a family unit. So this is company policy, similar to the country context. We didn't want all of these other elements to come into play when we talk about what constitutes a family. And then finally, we want to map what can be influenced, and then we work in stages, because small wins in the front changes the culture and the context for subsequent harder changes. And in the next few slides, we'll take you through how we divided up the project into different stages and changes, so that subsequent phase 2s and so on would be a lot easier to implement. So you may recognize this chart from earlier, from Jared. This is the first part where we have we identified a problem. There was a missing link in a definition. And for us, we identified that as a domestic partner definition or declaration. And then when we look at the universe of benefits that DAO gives to all recognized family units, we divided them into things that we can control and influence. So within DAO control, moderate level of influence, as well as lower level of influence. So within DAO control are all of the leave entitlement, family related benefits, etc. Now moderate level and lower level of influence are defined as benefits that engages a vendor. So medical, life, accident, death, and disability kind of insurance, and so on. And then a lower level of influence, medically supported surgical procedures, surrogacy, and so on and so forth. Jared, anything to add here?
No, I think what was important here, right, and one of the key messages from what Linda's shared, in the last few slides and here, is taking that realistic and strategic view of this, right? So to put it in a bit of context, what I mean there, and this is why I think allyship is so damn important in these type of things, right? When I first saw this as a gap, like I ran full on, right? Why haven't we done this already? Oh my God, it's right in front of us. We need to do it now. Come on. And just had that expectation that everyone would want to run, with me. And again, when you get those knocks back, it is extremely emotional, from a context of feeling quite let down that this is not something we can do overnight. But as we go through this, and particularly when Linda came on with that communication experience, and as an ally, we reframed it, right, and looked at it from a very strategic approach. Because at the end of the day, this is a super important but super sensitive topic, right? I mean, it's change management, but it is in Asia Pacific as well, something that is relatively new. People need to get their heads around this as change. So looking at it in this way, not only were we able to graphically represent it, but have more of a roadmap as to who were the stakeholders to engage, and being more, pragmatic about how we structured what we were going for. This was also a way that we, made it more bite-sized in what we wanted to approach and how we wanted to go about it, right? Because when you kind of throw it out there and expect that we're going to achieve everything overnight, at the end of the day, we need to be realistic. Change takes time. And this was also a great way that we were able to kind of break it down into those stages, right? So things that we can, as DAO, walk our talk and do tomorrow if we want to, right? And so that was a very easy way to say to our leadership, hey, this is something that, why not let's start here, but it can very easily be expanded to here and here. And so, no, I really like this way that you show it, Linda, in a sense of making sure it's clear within what we can do. There we go.
Yeah.
What we can do within stages.
Thanks, Beth, for that correction. I've updated it. So, I think this point on allyship is probably something that we don't have to feel too, how should I say, uncomfortable about, because this is just human nature, and it's just part of change management. If someone who has a vested interest starts trying to lead the change, it it's typically viewed, with questions by the others for whom that change is not going to impact as much. And this is not limited to LGBT community, right? Anyone who has a vested interest and is trying to drive something, you question, what's your motive? It's going to benefit you. That's why you're shouting so loudly. And that's why, the ally community, it's important for us to step forward and say, hey, look, this is important because there's a gap here and there's inequity. Let's make sure that we are equal across the company. There's inequality here. So yeah, just wanted to reiterate that point, Jared. So Jared, will you take us through our domestic partnership definition? I'm conscious of time. I think we might be running a little behind, but let's press ahead.
Yeah, let's jump forward. I mean, we can keep this relatively simple because I don't want to make it like too much of a, it's already quite a dialogue from us. And of course, if there's any questions, please feed them through. But for me, this is nothing game changing, right? So our inclusion criteria was a domestic partnership definition. Now, why I say this is not game changing, because we do this in the US, we do this in Australia, we do this in many locations whereby domestic partnership is not uncommon. Yes, in Asia Pacific, in a lot of our Asian societies, it's not necessarily something that we have formally recognized at a country level. But for us as an American company, it's something that we can say, hey, we already offer this, type of recognition in certain locations. Why not use this as what we use as our criteria? And so without going through every point here, it's a very simple process that we opted for, in a sense of being able to, for all intents and purposes, prove one's in a relationship, right? So, for example, have you been together for at least 12 consecutive months? And you prove that by showing X, Y, and Z. And so, in my mind, looking through what we're expecting here or asking here is not things that are, very difficult from a standpoint of a relationship to offer in many situations. But nonetheless, we did also, from the Asia Pacific context, need to make sure that this was relevant to the country level and the region that we're applying, which is why it was so important for legal to be involved with us through this process. As you'll see, there are some nuances in what we've got here in terms of what we would require in, say, for example, Vietnam or Japan. But nonetheless, I think it's very important that something like this is, yes, taken from the US, but you do check to make sure that it fits your context in Asia Pacific, as an example. But I think let's leave that there, Linda, and maybe move forward.
Okay, so Beth has a question. Have you run into issues where the DPs and CUs are not recognized by most states? Again, Beth, this is an internal DAO policy. So wherever you are in the DAO world, in Asia Pacific, we would recognize this. This outside of the company, of course, we have a team member from legal on the committee, and we know that there are some countries where it's problematic. But again, this is within DAO. Okay, so Jared, apologies for that. Let's move to the next slide. If I can get this moving. Yep, this is it. Jared?
Yes, so I think we wanted to make sure that through this conversation, we define what we saw as Asia Pacific, and just simply due to geographic, all companies kind of see it as different, right? But we did this in a stage that we kind of broke it up into pieces, right? Again, back to that point about being pragmatic, about biting off, an appropriate amount and doing it in stages. So we saw implementation phase 1 as the countries listed there on the left, and implementation phase 2 implement on the right. Why we did this was because there's obviously a lot more challenges in terms of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Myanmar in terms of the country level legislation. But as Linda commented earlier, that does not exclude those individuals from being able to access this type of benefit. We just need to approach it from, one, a communication standpoint differently. We also need to be sensitive about maintaining their safety and security of our employees, right? So ensuring that what we do offer is not going to put them in harm's way when they leave the DAO premises. And so I think it was definitely a staged approach. Australia and New Zealand, obviously, in a slightly different different category in a sense that there is already recognition available. But nonetheless, you know, this is how we kind of split from a regional view.
Yeah, just a correction that Myanmar is on phase 2 because we have such a small footprint in Myanmar that they follow the policies of Vietnam. But for cleanliness sake, we put it as a phase 2 because when you grow bigger, they will have their own policies and then we will attack it. And it would already, you know, grandfather whatever other policies we have outside of Myanmar into this country. Okay, we're going to show you an example. If I can get my slides to progress. Okay, there we go. Jared?
Yeah, so we just wanted to give a bit of an example here in terms of how we looked at this, right? So when we did a very detailed review, we did that with, you know, HR and legal from each and every country to obviously make sure that while we were doing this, we were still not in breach of any you know, labor laws or local requirements, right? So it was obviously a very extensive study, and that took a fair amount of time. But nonetheless, it was certainly critical for us also to be able to define to ourselves internally, what is this actually going to mean? And so, I mean, we put just an example of Japan and Korea, South Korea, on the screen rather than showing you each and every country because they become a little bit similar. But the things that we kind of saw within our scope, right, particularly around leave. Leave is something that, in my mind, is something right there in front of us. It's something that is controlled by the company generally. We define how much leave we can let our employees take. And so we highlight leave here, right? And so where we have current eligibility, that was the eligibility as we entered this project, right? And the new eligibility being what would be extended, assuming that an individual went through the process of declaring their domestic partnership through the process that we've launched. And so as you can see, you know, from a standpoint of having that formal legal recognition in Japan, for example, almost everything required some form of certification. And so this certificate then was able to bridge quite a number of gaps and allowing individuals to quite, you know, expand their options in terms of the benefits around leave in particular.
And what I would add here is that, you know, we love our HR team. They took the opportunity to look at our people policy and made it gender neutral. So they use gender neutral language to describe the policies that extend beyond this as well. So kudos to them for really embracing that spirit. And also, you know, when we implemented this policy update, we're like, we don't know where or how or who it will benefit. But then, you know, and everything is confidential and anonymous, but we did hear of the fact that someone in Korea did inquire about this policy. And that really was enough for us to more than enough for us to feel that, you know, we're really making an impact immediately. And, you know, to date, we don't know who else has used it because, you know, this is all confidential. But we really take heart that, you know, it is changing the context within DAO. So with that, you know, let's talk a little bit about phase 2 for us in Asia Pacific. So the rest of it, right, which is the ones that's enabled by vendors and whatever else. So, you know, again, taking our lessons from phase 1 as well, we are going to be prioritizing the different types of insurance coverage and so on, and see where the low-hanging fruits are, the easier one to get done. And you know, neither Jared and I are insurance experts on what needs to be covered and so on. So again, we'll be bringing back together our project team, and then walking through and getting the necessary advice that's needed to prioritize and help us to figure out which are the ones that we can implement first, second, and third, you know, as we move forward. So we've come to our final slide, the insights and tips. Jared, why don't you help us close the presentation too?
Yeah, I think first, before I do that, Linda, I saw that Stephanie posed a question as to whether children were in scope here, as in curious if children are covered who are a part of the family, but the person with the benefits is not the legal guardian. So I think your question relates a little bit to US. You referred to your state where with your personal situation. Our context here was very much Asia Pacific. So unfortunately, I can't comment too much about our policies in the US. Yeah, so my apologies that I can't give a more robust answer, but I think it's a really important aspect, right? And, you know, it really talks to that this is one part of the journey towards upgrading our policies, right? And so, you know, like we indicated, we've gone through phase 1, phase 2 is certainly going to be around those buckets, but, you know, continually expanding what, you know, is the recognition of different family types and you know, in a sense, how we're all unique, right? And recognizing it for what it is certainly important to us outside of the US, as much and as important as it is making sure that our US policies are also continually evolving. From the standpoint of where do we go from here, right? And as we wrap it up, look, honestly, I mean, like Linda said, it's that little satisfaction when you hear that there are people inquiring about this policy, right? I mean, nonetheless, I mean, at the end of the day, we didn't do it so that it would be like this mad rush. I mean, if people wanted to apply, absolutely, the policy is now there. But in my mind, in a region like Asia Pacific, whereby you know, it is still relatively taboo, a lot of these topics, right? It's slowly changing that context that we can talk about this, that it's on the table, it's available. Our people leaders have been trained into how to navigate these policies and the fact that they're available for their teams. HR is now a different context. I mean, as Linda shared, it then led HR to take on an initiative to look at pronouns within the region, right? So these small updates have this trickle effect into a bigger impact that we've been able to have on the inclusion discussion within the Asia Pacific region. And I think that, you know, it's been really special to see it evolve into something more and something bigger. I think those early wins, you know, that we were able to have. So, for example, like I said, when I went full steam ahead at it, but then, you know, kept hitting a brick wall, it was super demotivating to say, well, hey, you know, where are we going? But then when we reframed that conversation, made it more strategic, more formal, more of a project, and then we started to get a sponsor on board who said, hey, why are we not doing this? Then when we were able to see the team building, those small wins were extremely motivating, and it snowballed from there. But, you know, before I get some final comments from you as well, Linda, you know, to share quite excitingly from Dow, these type of things then have a ripple effect outside of the region, right? So I see this as a great win for what we've done in Dow Asia Pacific. But, you know, since then, as a result of this, it's kind of validated for us, particularly outside of the US, right, as a US company, you know, that we can do these type of things and roll them out. It doesn't necessarily have to be on a global context. Sometimes that makes sense to roll out policies globally, but at times it makes sense to do regional-based projects. Then you have that ability to tailor for the region. So something like this, I mean, we're looking also at rolling this out in Europe, Middle East, Africa. Obviously, we have a lot of complexities in that program, given the sensitivities around the Middle East and Africa in terms of the legislative, but also cultural and religious context that we need to consider. So by no means a small project as well, but nonetheless, we're getting the project shaped up to roll this out further as well. Which from my mind is extremely exciting to see that it's not necessarily just a project now in Asia, but we're seeing this as a global project as we continue to expand this. But I don't know, Linda, did you have any final comments? I'll also check if there's any other questions.
Sure. I think the one thing I want to say is that as an ally, you know, it has been really a privilege to work on this project, and I've learned so much as well. It just like that correction from Beth just now. Sometimes I still use words or language that may not be as acceptable or appropriate, and I have to feel comfortable that Jared isn't offended when I use the wrong words and accidentally says, non-traditional or unconventional or things like that. And it's important that I feel safe and I feel able to learn from the community and learn from each other, so that it makes it just build a more inclusive world here. Any questions from either the site? I don't see any on Zoom here.
I saw that Griffin asked a question in regards to whether these type of policies, can also have an impact on local legislation, right? And I think that's definitely a bigger conversation in terms of the advocacy impact that, these type of changes, and is also a mandate in my mind that corporations can also have at a legislative level. In a sense, I've kind of stepped out of Asia Pacific, so I can't add too much context as to what's happened since. But while I was there, for example, we did use this type of dialogue, particularly as the Thailand Partnership Bill was coming up, to be able to frame the dialogue around why that is so important, right? And so, it was kind of running in parallel. But, when initiatives and opportunities come up, I think that we all have a responsibility to raise this type of, initiative, to the legislative level. I don't know, Linda, if you have any comments over the past year, if there's been any other external engagement whereby we can highlight this.
Yeah. So every opportunity we have, of course, we talk about this policy update to the other companies. And based on my experience, having worked in government affairs as well, is that a single company really difficult for us to drive any change as a single company. What's needed is for groups of businesses to band together, whether it's the American MNC community or chemicals industry, like where Dow is working on, and so on. So build those alliances, we were trying to, US ASEAN Business Council was very, very supportive of trying to do something and having a joint position on LGBT and what US companies believe and stand for. It didn't gather enough steam. So I would encourage you, if you want to think outside of your company, to look for like-minded, band together, form alliances. It probably would work better if those groupings and those joint collaborative efforts are parked under an existing and strong institution that can help open doors and talk about this is an important part of negotiations and trade discussions and so on.
Absolutely. No, great question, and I think there's been a number of comments in the chat, so very, very much appreciate the feedback. Look, as always, and as is the spirit of Summit, we're all here to learn from one another, as we saw with the support from a language perspective in the chat, which helped us to do some live updates. But nonetheless, we're extremely proud of this, and I think we're all on a journey to continually improve within our organizations, right? So I put it out there. You can find Linda and my contact details in the profiles, our LinkedIn, our Twitter, whatever form. Feel free to reach out to us. We're always open to have a chat about how, in a bit more detail, how we structured this and how you might be able to do the same thing within your organizations, whether that's in Asia Pacific or elsewhere. But nonetheless, an offer of support there if we can ever help. So I think with that, maybe we can call it a wrap. Since I don't see any other questions, I'll do a last check.
Okay.
But no, that seems to be it for now. But yeah, fantastic. Again, thank you all so much for dialing in today.
Thank you. All right. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Oh, thank you. We have some thank you in the chat. Appreciate you guys joining.
Thank you so much. Okay, stop recording. Are you sure you're on?